Hi, welcome to the HealthScore Longevity Report. Each week, I will cover a study in the top-tier medical literature where all-cause mortality was measured and a factor was studied that is modifiable. What I'm looking for are things we can do to increase our lifespan and things we can avoid to increase our lifespan. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at a study that showed that there was an increased risk of cardiovascular disease with poultry consumption, a 4% increased risk of cardiovascular disease with poultry consumption. And the researchers hypothesized that the cause of poultry's harm might be the fact that people are eating fried chicken. And fried food has been associated with increased mortality. Now, when I heard that, I followed up on the reference on the study that implicates fried food with all-cause mortality, and that's the study we're talking about today. So we're answering the question, should you eat fried food? This study was published in the British Medical Journal in January 2019. BMJ has an impact factor of 93.3, which means that the average article in this journal is cited 93.3 times every 2 years in the medical literature. An impact factor of 10 or greater is considered excellent. Having an impact factor of 93.3 makes BMJ one of the best medical journals in the world and giving us some credence in the study's findings in particular. So some background, what is fried food? So fried food is anything that's been cooked in oil. And we're primarily talking about deep fried food. For the purposes of this study, they looked at fried chicken, fried seafood like shrimp, and they looked at other fried food, which includes potato chips, corn chips, French fries, tortilla chips, and tacos. So what is the consumption of fried food in the U.S.? Well, I couldn't find that particular statistic, but what I could find is that 25 to 36% of U.S. adults consume fast food every day, and fast food tends to be predominantly fried. So from that, we can guess that about a quarter to a third of U.S. adults consume fried food every day. Now, what's already known about fried food and health? Well, fried food has been implicated in several cohort studies in the incidence of diabetes. More fried food, higher risk of diabetes. More fried food, higher risk of cardiovascular disease. But until this study, the question of fried food and all-cause mortality has not been investigated. So this study used data from the Women's Health Initiative. The Women's Health Initiative has been used for several analyses. It included 106,966 postmenopausal women aged 50 to 79. They were enrolled between September 93 and 1998. And followed until February 2017, over 30 years. They had a baseline dietary assessment performed, which is why we can have the current study. But they also had everything else about them measured, from education to other health risk factors. And then they had their outcomes assessed in terms of developing cancer, heart disease, or all-cause mortality. The researchers divided the women up into quartiles of total fried food consumption. There was a group with no fried food consumption, and there was a group with a serving or more a day. And the researchers asked, is there any other differences in these groups when we look at other variables besides their total fried food consumption? And we can see the answer to that question in Table 1. Here we have Table 1, which shows the baseline characteristics of the women. This is the column for women who consumed no fried food. This is the column for women who consumed a serving or more a day. And these numbers will show you that there's a big difference between these groups. So if we look at the women who ate the most fried food, they had the highest rate of tobacco use. They had the highest rate of being inactive. They consumed the most calories in a given day. They had the lowest dietary score, which is a composite score of 11 elements of diet. They were most likely to have diabetes. They were the most likely to have a body mass index of greater than 30. They ate the least amount of vegetables, least amount of fruit, least amount of whole grains, the most sugar-sweetened beverages, the most red and processed meat. So we can see from baseline, when we separate out the women by how much fried food they ate, they also differed in a lot of other ways, which are relevant to their health. Next, the researchers asked, did the group that ate the most fried food have the highest rate of death in the follow-up period? Let's look at that table. That's table 2. Now, what's so cool about statistics is the researchers can control for all those variables that we talked about. All those variables like the total energy intake, like the smoking, like the physical inactivity, like the unhealthy diet, like the diabetes. In multivariable model 1, they controlled for all of those characteristics. So they could see if we just are looking at the fried food consumption, is there effect on mortality in the follow-up period? And this is the group that had no fried food consumption. And as fried food consumption increases, the hazard ratio is increasing. A hazard ratio would be the added risk to this group compared to the group who doesn't eat fried food. So a 1.01 hazard ratio is a 1% higher risk of mortality for people who consume less than a serving a week compared to those who consume none at all. But remember, we have to look at the 95% confidence interval in brackets. If that 95% confidence interval crosses 1, then we cannot have confidence in the results, which means that there's no harm from consuming fried food at less than a serving a week compared to none. How about 1 to 2 servings a week? The hazard ratio is 1.03, a 3% higher risk, but the confidence interval crosses 1. So we can say there's no difference between the group that ate 1 to 2 servings of fried food per week compared to none. How about 3 to 6 servings? 3% higher risk of all-cause mortality compared to no fried food, but the confidence interval crosses 1, so we can't have confidence in that finding. How about 1 serving or more per day? Here, we have an 8% higher risk of mortality for that group. The confidence interval does not cross 1. So this is our first and our only finding that's significant. We can actually believe. The takeaway from this chart right here, and the main finding of the study, is that if you consume a serving or more of fried food a day, you increase mortality by 8% compared to no fried food consumption. Okay, so at this point, we know that eating a serving or more a day of fried food increases mortality by 8% compared to not consuming it at all. What about the individual components of fried food, like fried chicken and fried seafood, and other fried foods like chips and French fries? So that is table 3. Table 3 is looking at the association of individual fried foods with all-cause mortality. So in model 1, we can see that, so for fried chicken, compared to no fried chicken at all, having less than 2 servings a month increased all-cause mortality by 6%, and the confidence interval doesn't cross 1. So that is really significant. At as little as 1 serving a month, there's an increase in mortality from fried chicken consumption. As fried chicken consumption increased, so too did the risk of all-cause mortality, up to 13% higher risk of all-cause mortality when consuming a serving a week. So far we have that total fried food consumption at a serving a day or more increases mortality. Fried chicken consumption in particular at anything more than none at all increases mortality. And now we have fried seafood. And compared to no fried seafood at all, having less than 2 servings a month actually decrease mortality, and it doesn't cross 1. So we can have confidence in that consuming less than 2 servings a month of fried seafood compared to none is protective. And at 2 to 3 servings a month, the confidence interval crosses 1, so we can have no confidence in that finding, but we can have confidence in this finding. At a serving per week or more, fried seafood increases all-cause mortality. Confidence interval doesn't cross 1. So far we have, if you consume 1 serving or more of any kind of fried food a day, there's a risk. If you consume anything more than none at all of fried chicken, there's a risk. Even if you consume 1 serving or more a week of fried seafood, there's a health risk. Finally, when we compare other fried foods, this analysis looked at most at 1 serving or more per week. None of the associations were significant. So to give you a summary of our findings, for fried chicken, anything more than none in the 2 servings or less category, there was an all-cause mortality risk. When it came to fried seafood, the risk began at a serving or more per week. And when it came to total fried food consumption, then the harm occurs at a serving or more per day. There's harm when your consumption of fried food that's other than fish and chicken exceeds a serving or more per day. So we see now that there's a risk in all-cause mortality from the consumption of fried food in general. When it comes to potato chips and French fries, the risk occurs at a serving or more per day. When it comes to seafood, the risk occurs at a serving or more per week. And when it comes to chicken, the risk occurs really at any consumption above none. But what's the actual cause of this increased risk in all-cause mortality? Well, that was discussed by the authors. The first theory is that when we deep fry foods, we're adding a lot of calories to the food. And also when we deep fry foods, we're making them incredibly delicious, crunchy, and juicy. And that increased calorie intake could be the cause of obesity, and obesity could be the cause of this increased mortality. But the researchers recall in Model 1, they controlled for total energy intake. So even when 2 people ate the same amount of calories, but one person ate fried food and another person didn't, there was a risk from eating fried food. And in Model 2, they controlled for obesity, for BMI. So even 2 women who both were normal weight, the one who had fried food had an increased mortality. So neither the increased calorie density or the increased intake because it's delicious theories hold up. What about increased trans fats? So we know that trans fats increase risk of all-cause mortality. Frying deteriorates oils by the process of oxidation and hydrogenation. It leads to a loss of unsaturated fatty acids like linoleic acid and an increase in corresponding trans fatty acids like translinoleic acid. And we know that trans fats are harmful. So the question is, could this harm from fried food be because we're eating trans fats? The researchers actually explored this possibility in what's called a sensitivity analysis and was included in the supplement to this article. They controlled for trans fat intake, which means that if trans fats are responsible for the harm from fried foods, then when we look at the groups and control for trans fat intake, we won't see a difference in mortality. It will be accounted for because we're controlling for the trans fats. But what the results show is that there's still harm that persists from eating fried foods even when we control for trans fat intake. So when you compare 2 women who had the exact same trans fat intake, the woman eating fried food at a serving or more per day still had an 8% higher risk of all-cause mortality. So the trans fats are not the explanation. So far, we can say that the cause of harm from fried food isn't that we eat more of it, isn't obesity, it isn't eating more trans fats. The mortality from fried food persists, even in women with the same calorie intake, same body mass index, same intake of trans fatty acids. Another possibility is acrylamide. Frying at high temperatures can lead to acrylamide formation in some foods, such as French fries and potatoes. And dietary acrylamide intake has been associated with higher risk of all-cause mortality. This could possibly explain to some extent the harm seen from total consumption of fried food. But what we really saw in this study was that animal fried food, poultry, was the most harmful. And acrylamide isn't significantly produced by fried chicken. So we still haven't explained how the most harmful member of the group, poultry, could be doing its harm. Finally, and this is probably a bigger contributor, is the production of advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. Basically, when you take a protein or fat and you cook it, you have what's called the Maillard or browning reaction. That browning reaction is the coming together of a sugar molecule and a protein or a fat. That's why it's called glycation for glucose. It causes the food to get brown, but it also produces these advanced glycation end products. And these AGEs have been associated with cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And they do this through inducing oxidative stress and inflammation. Now, AGEs are present in many foods, especially proteins and fats, but they're increased by the cooking method. And the more the cooking method browns the food, the more AGEs are produced. So let me show you a fascinating table on this topic. This is an article on advanced glycation end products. It was published in the Journal of the American Dietetic Association in 2013. We'll look at a table of over 500 foods, and what we're interested in is the far right column, which shows us the amount of AGEs per serving. We said that when you cook meat, you produce advanced glycation end products, and the more brown it gets, the more end products you produce. So if you take raw white meat, 789 AGEs, pan fry that meat in oil, and you double the AGEs. And if you deep fry that chicken, you'll have nearly tenfold AGEs. We can see that by boiling chicken, which doesn't really brown it at all, we barely increase the AGEs. So all that is to say that a potential cause of the increased mortality that we see unique to the seafood and the chicken in this study is the production of advanced glycation end products through cooking. So the key takeaways from this study are there is harm from eating fried chicken. Anything more than not at all causes a mortality risk. There is harm from eating fried seafood. Anything more than a serving a week causes harm. And there's harm from eating other fried foods, potato chips, French fries, tortillas, etc. A harm from consuming a serving or more per day.
Here's what I personally do with regard to this topic. So first of all, I do eat chicken and I do eat seafood. It seems like seafood is neutral. Poultry can cause an increased risk in cardiovascular disease, but currently the research probably suggests that this is due to the deep frying. So I avoid deep frying, but I do eat poultry and I do eat seafood. I do avoid red meat. I prepare my own food, and the method I use for cooking is air frying. I didn't really know about AGEs that much before this topic. Now that I see that the amount of oil and the amount of cooking of the oil and the amount of browning of the protein, the worse it is for your health, I'm more confident that air frying is a good idea because it limits the amount of oil that I'm cooking. And I'm also going to be careful not to overcook the protein to prevent the furthering of that browning reaction. As far as potato chips, tortillas, corn chips, I prepare my own food. I don't buy any kind of snacks or packaged food, so that hasn't been a problem. I hope that helps. Thanks.